Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Our guest today is Hicham Oudghiri. He is the CEO of Enigma. Hicham, tell us about yourself.
Hi there, my name is Hicham Oudghiri. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Enigma. Enigma is a data technology company in New York focused on basically providing the identity and health of over 30 million small businesses in the US. It's a particularly hairy problem. There's extremely low visibility into the small businesses, and it's one of the most important sectors of the economy. It's been traditionally extremely difficult to get these businesses access to credit, and we help the financial ecosystem understand these businesses more so that they can be more ambitious in their lending and supporting these businesses with their needs.
So what you're saying is this kind of like a Dun and Bradstreet for small businesses?
Definitely. I mean, Dun and Bradstreet's a company in the industry. They've been around for very long. You know, Abraham Lincoln was actually an employee of Dun and Bradstreet.
I did not know that.
Which is a funny tidbit. But our approach is just data science driven fundamentally, right?
Okay.
I think the data business is much, much older than the technology business, if you think about it, actually, right? Data has been around and been used before computers were even invented. And our approach is one that really centers around entity resolution and the ability to combine all kinds of extremely diverse data sets and viewpoints to come up with a much more predictive view on a business, on the economy. And so we definitely sit in this world amongst these very, very large data companies that have been around for a while, but think that there's a much more kind of data-driven, machine learning-driven way to even build the data business, which is ironic in and of itself.
Okay, so before we follow up with that, I want to go back to this Abraham Lincoln comment because you have kind of sparked an idea. So Dun and Bradstreet's been around long enough that our 16th president, one of our greatest presidents, was an employee. Further, if you go even farther back, if you look at Europe, which is obviously influential throughout the entire world into the United States as well because of the immigration and all of that. And I don't remember the exact number, but I read an article a while back that the top 440 or 660 or something like that families in Europe are still the same families that were the richest families 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, right? The wealth has accumulated to the point where they're essentially untouchable. And that's not to say from a criminal perspective, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that, there's an infrastructure that has been built around these families through, 1,500 years, and it is static at this point. And when I roll this forward, I actually had a really great conversation with our chief operating officer, Amanda Nystrom, about this. At what point should a company no longer be allowed to function as that company? And there's a couple of companies you can think about. GM is a good example. GM has been around for over 100 years, except that they haven't been around over 100 years because in 08 or 09, they needed the bailout. And this isn't an issue of whether or not they should have been bailed out. That's not what I'm discussing. But what happened was it was a reverse merger. So the GM of today is literally not the same GM, even though it may have the same shareholders, it may have the same, board or whatever. It's a different company than it was previously. And when you look at something like a Dun & Bradstreet, which I've never had a problem with Dun & Bradstreat, they seem to do what they do, and I don't have any. Okay, great. But at what point do you say, okay, time to start over? Is it, take Ford, Henry Ford. Is it when Henry Ford passed on, can only one further generation continue that corporation? At what point do we divest, or should we divest, right? Because currently especially in the current political climate, there is a large push for income disparity, resolving some of those issues. And a lot of those issues are caused by historically having companies that are still operating after hundreds or thousands of years because they are able to consolidate influence, whether that be money or power or authority, assets. Catholic Church is a great example, the largest landowner in the world, that type of thing. And again, this is not about attacking those entities, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts on longevity and equity in terms of having these long living institutions?
First of all, fascinating question. I think, listen, I think there are two things that I'm really excited about when I think about the history of companies and the history of institutions. One that relates specifically to the moment of time that we're in, and kind of what motivates us at Enigma. I think, listen, if you think about it, there's this notion of, alone, we can go only so far. And so companies are this amazing way to kind of collectivize the brain power of a bunch of people, right? That's all companies are, essentially, right? They are the brain power and the sum of all actions by the people that that work there. And then eventually they start to build products and assets and develop moats that make it really, really hard for other companies to compete. And what we saw with the Industrial Revolution is just this massive kind of advance by companies who had been successful, who did have capital, and were able to just grow to these ginormous sizes. And it was kind of thought that these companies would be around to stay forever, and that their size and scale in and of itself was the barrier to competition. But I think what we're seeing now, as we kind of zoom past the Industrial Revolution, no pun intended, and to this extremely digital, kind of more decentralized age, I think that barrier for competition, which was one scale, is basically quickly disappearing, right? So I'll give you just the easiest example. If you take a look at kind of Anheuser-Busch's corporate strategy, or any one of these large CPG companies, what they're doing right now is basically identifying all of the kind of microbrewery, small brand drinks who are able to do things that they've never done before to gain market share. Like, it is extremely easy to go get partial time at a factory right now to make a run of your product. It is extremely easy to link up with a small design agency who has the prowess of what, a large Madison Avenue firm would have commanded on its own 50 years ago, right? And suddenly you have a brand. Distribution can be done directly to clients, right? We don't have to necessarily buy your way into stocking the product and kind of pumping the demand up for something new. You can target people directly. And so we view this, and I view this kind of move towards decentralization because of technology, ultimately the first step to small businesses becoming an even more important part of the economy, and in fact the kind of creative and innovative driver of this. Certainly see this in the technology space, where a small team can kind of out nimble the largest incumbents. But I think it's much larger than tech companies itself. It's really tech enabling a kind of decentralization of the economy, because the platforms exist for at scale distribution. The platforms exist for at scale creation of awareness. And those 1,000-year-old companies, they won't have much left in the barrier of competition, and I think will be very, very weighed down by the legacy they have to manage. So I'm very optimistic that that point of view could have held for hundreds of years, but likely not long into the future.
Now that's interesting to me because I think there's two sides, trying an objective view of what you said. One of them is that the ease of access to technology is going to increase the ease of access to market, which is going to increase competition. Here's the problem. Once you increase competition, basic economics, prices go down, right? Now that's good. You can end up in a situation where things are more equitable. But using Anheuser-Busch as an example, they're just buying everybody. So there is no competition.
Correct.
So
I mean, yes,
right.
you have the monopoly concern where, basically, or like Facebook's strategy, which has been so masterfully executed, right? Which is to kind of identify their competition super early and just go out and buy it and integrate it into their ad network, right?
Now, let me interject here because I think this is fascinating, and this will actually, I think that this will distinguish our age difference. You said Facebook. I think Microsoft. Because that's exactly what Microsoft did. They didn't make Excel. They didn't make Excel. They didn't make LinkedIn. They didn't make Skype, right? They didn't make hyperscale, which is something that's in my world, which is the Postgres world. They bought Citus, is what they did.
Yep.
Now that isn't to take away from Microsoft. It's just to show a pronounced vision, and Facebook is also a good example. I just wish Mark Zuckerberg wasn't such a interesting individual as to willing to buy 640 acres and cut it off from indigenous people in Hawaii. That's a fact. Look it up. But Facebook is also, they did WhatsApp, and then they did Instagram, and I'm sure they've got their hand, or Oculus is a perfect example. My family owns Oculuses, and we have to have a Facebook account to use Oculus, which I find unfortunate. So there is definitely that. But again, what's happening is that the larger corporations are creating basically fiefdoms. And we're ending up in this situation where, sure, on a lesser level, and Command Prompt's a perfect example of this. We work with a lot of the big boys because we're able to be more nimble than they are, and we're more flexible. We get in there, we can solve the problems. We make big boys look good. We have a great reputation for solving problems for clients, and therefore it works. But if you look at a different industry, let's say retail. Now, part of this is fascinating because I went through a very rural part of Oregon a couple of years ago and went into an antique shop. That antique shop, I found a knife that had been made in that town. They had found it in an old barn where the guy had a home blacksmithy. And I wanted this knife. So I bought the knife, but I made an offer on the knife. And the individual said, let me check. And the individual went on eBay and did a quick comparative to see if I was offering a fair price. Now, that to me is awesome. That is amazing. And so from that level, I think you're absolutely correct. We're creating a more equitable playing field for everyone to actually be able to succeed. But on the other hand, you have the GEs, you have the Dun & Bradstreets. I mean, let's be honest, Dun & Bradstreet finds that your particular direction with Enigma is of even just fascination. They may approach you and say, hey, why don't you come on board? And, and not saying that you would say yes, but when someone like Dun & Bradstreet comes to you with a checkbook, you at least listen. So on that vein, right, I don't think it's as simple as making it equitable for small businesses. I think what happens is that you do in a situation where like an Anheuser-Busch just starts swallowing up the particularly interesting competitors, which again reduces competition, which keeps prices higher than what they would necessarily need to be.
Correct. Like there's in a transition, it doesn't look like a linear line. It's going to look like a lot of ups and downs towards this direction, in my opinion, right? but the fundamental premise holds where, like, take say what we're doing at Enigma, like I describe our mission sometimes to folks as basically destroying the information arbitrage available to large companies versus small companies. Like, we can equip a young company, take say a new fintech, to compete against the largest banks with this on the same playing field from a data perspective. And yes, people will get bought and sold in the cycle, but the idea is that, fundamentally, the barriers to starting a business and getting innovation out into the hands of users and consumers, that barrier is coming down no matter how many people buy it on the back end. And even these brands, they're like, take say the Anheuser-Busch example, the brands are being run pretty independently, right? So there is a lot of transfer, in my opinion, from these big pockets of wealth to, to more innovative companies growing. And, fundamentally, we just haven't seen that in the kind of the data about, inequity and just more, the distribution of wealth has definitely kind of not supported this theory. But I think it'll take so much more time for this to play out. I mean, maybe over even like hundreds of years in and of itself. I just see the fundamentals, the like qualitative fundamentals of being able to get, up and running. I remember when we started our business, AWS was not even, the thing. It wasn't necessarily something that you naturally gravitated to the way in which you do it today, where AWS will kind of kick you off with $150,000 worth of credits. Like, I remember, in your world of things, like being on the like Postgres IRC channel, talking to random folks. Special shout out to, I don't know if you know this blog, Rhodium Toad.
I very much know Rhodium Toad.
Yeah.
So some history here. I'm actually the founder of United States PostgreSQL.
No.
I've been doing this. I wrote a book for O'Reilly back in the day called Practical PostgreSQL. It was like 2001. I'm the founder of United States PostgreSQL. I sat on the board of Software in the Public Interest, which is the nonprofit for Debian, as well as PostgreSQL.org, as what they call the liaison, which was basically the treasurer. I did that for almost a decade. And Rhodium and Toad and I mean, he actually agreed, shout out. He is the one that helped me understand in a consumable way that I could then educate people on, because I used to do a lot of training on how PostgreSQL handles data rights.
Ooh, fascinating.
Yeah, he's an amazingly wonderful individual. He's always been very helpful, traditionalist in the sense of the internet is open, let's help everyone be successful. So it's actually really cool that you brought up some of that, OG technology, I guess, that we were dealing with back in the day.
I mean, just the ability, I wasn't very familiar with kind of the more infrastructural uses of data. I mean, I kind of grew up in the energy industry, very much so doing kind of Moneyball-like things in the energy industry, first in Texas and then all over Africa, where I'm originally from Morocco. I had the opportunity to do a lot of sustainable investing in Africa using data. But when I started Enigma, I remember us loading kind of very, very large public open data sets into Postgres, where, it was the very first place where they landed. Things are different today. But I remember Rhodium Toad, I'll give you the snippet, and this will kind of age me as a person and out me in terms of how bad of a developer I am. But I remember him teaching my co-founder and I basically the copy statement and like how to use that to load data into Postgres much faster, as opposed to inserting things line by line, which we were doing the
That's
very first
terrible.
couple of weeks that we were loading data. You just kind of gravitate towards the insert statement and then your data gets larger and larger and you're like, okay, all right, let's do the copy. And then you have to kind of rework how it is that you're parsing things and formatting things for the right schema. But that's the specific Rhodium Toad shout out I care about the most, more than any.
Yeah, so let's get back to what Enigma does for a moment. You said something that was interesting. You said that you enable small companies like a new fintech company to basically level their playing field against some of the big guys, say like a Morgan Stanley or JP or something like that. What does that actually mean? Like command prompt comes to you and because one of the things you said in the beginning was that you enable insights into the stability of smaller companies so that, say, a bank can feel more comfortable lending to that company. Now,
Yep.
command prompt is very, we're a cash-based company, always have been. We don't do debt. Of course, we have credit lines. It's only responsible because we have employees. But we don't invest backwards. If we're going to do something, we just pay for it. But how does that help? How do you help someone like a command prompt saying, you know what, we've got this brilliant idea, we don't want to go to VC, but we need, say, $10 million. What is the data that you are providing? I mean, how do you have insight into command prompt? Because we're a small business, we're not public.
Yeah, well, there's tons of products that are available to small business kind of canonically in market. The first is, just straight up credit cards, right? Which you use to pay things on a monthly basis. You have invoices, they come at a certain time. You have expenses, they come at a certain time, just managing that cash flow. Cards have been an extraordinarily important product, but even for cards, like small businesses face hassles in getting them. And I'll give you a personal anecdote. A couple of banks have invested in us, Capital One, Amex, Truist over the years. And I won't kind of out any specific one, but let's just say we had raised a pretty large round. And a couple of weeks after, we hit up one of the banks for a credit card and we got rejected. I mean, we had raised, I think, like millions of dollars, and we got rejected for a $20,000 line of credit. Okay. And the reason was they couldn't verify us as a business. They're like, you gave us an address that wasn't your corporate registration address. You gave us a phone number that didn't link back to you. And we were like, whoa, what do you mean address? We've moved 3 times, in the last, year and a half. We're a pretty fast growing company. And we've never had a landline. We don't need a landline. We have, cell phones and like virtual lines, voice IP lines. And even that process of onboarding small businesses is the kind of thing that, we fix on a day-to-day basis, be it with big folks or small folks. So the problems are just way more acute than people think. Like, try renting a car as a small business, right? And the kind of paperwork that you have to do. So that's one thing. Then there's, I'm getting back to original question, but
Yeah,
you were saying?
I was going to say, this is a unique situation, because since I almost wonder if this is because of the generation you're in. And I'll give you an example. Command prompt, we've never had any of those problems, ever. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying they don't exist. But what I'm saying is that when we started business, right, the internet was young. Now, certainly the internet as a technology was not. It's been around since the 70s. But as a business orientation of how you conduct business, it was young. It was in the late 90s. And so you had a fax machine. You had a landline. You had, you had an Amex, right? Now, even today, we still have the same fax machine, which actually wasn't a physical fax machine. It was a fax number that was virtual, but banks didn't know it was virtual. And our voicemail runs the exact same number we've had since day one, but it's just a voicemail box. You're right. We don't have any landlines. We have all our cell phones. And so I wonder if there's it's basically a growing pains issue. You know, especially banks, are not known for innovative things. They are known for moving very slow, being very cumbersome, very bureaucratic. And as someone who works with a lot of banks, I can tell you, largely does not understand technology at all. It is amazing to me how many people are employed by banks that are in technology that do not understand technology at all. So I wonder if with you, right, you're talking about like the last decade or so, right, where you're right, your whole business may be run from a Skype number and an Etsy page. That doesn't mean you're not legitimate. It doesn't mean you're not doing, 9 figures. It's just not the old way.
And if you tack onto this, and by the way, you're absolutely right to call out the kind of time component, because really what's happened over the last 30 years is that the relationship in between the small business and the bank has been severed with consolidation of the large banks. I mean, there used to be much, much more diversity in the banking system. I mean, there still is today. Like 43% of outstanding small business debt is held by community banks. They play an extremely important role in the sector. And we saw this with kind of how PPP was rolled out. But it was even more so. And so the consolidation in the banking system that happened with kind of deregulation, in the late 80s, 90s, and just kind of the Wall Street drive towards consolidation in the 2000s, like that's really what severed the relationship. And you can't just kind of go into your banker who understands your business, who is local to you. You're now suddenly dealing with kind of an abstracted relationship and an attempt to manage small businesses at scale, using technology, and that technology and that prowess and that data just hasn't gotten to the banking system in a way that replaces that very human understanding as it existed in the past.
That's interesting. I never really put that correlation together. I mean, obviously, I agree with you with the consolidation, deregulation. We saw a lot of it when the mortgage crisis hit in 2008.
Correct.
And you kind of had to, right? Because you had to have the larger organizations be able to take up that debt so that the economy didn't. I mean, a lot of people, don't get me wrong, people were hit very hard when that happened, but it could have been so much worse if we didn't have that consolidation and build up. And now it would seem that we really should start. I mean, if you talk to any personal finance person, for example, out of their mouth is go to a credit union, right? That's what you want to do. You want to go to a credit union, don't go to a big bank, those types of things. But again, let's get back to the original part here. What is it with Enigma? I'm still having a hard time grasping the concrete. What is, if you come to me with a bag of rocks that represent Enigma, what does that mean? Yeah.
Totally. So, again, we provide two categories of information. One is identity, right? That would allow you to onboard a customer with confidence, right? They exist, they're legitimate, they have a footprint in the data. This is someone that you can onboard automatically, right? So automation is a huge part of what we try to enable for folks. That alone is, what helps folks, small businesses get the services they need, without kind of waiting days and days and days in the funnel and going back and forth on paperwork and sending your corporate registration documents and all kinds of notarized material, et cetera, right? The other is the health of a business, which we get from all kinds of signals. We collect data from namely three places. One is public, like the public data that's available, that's released by all kinds of institutions, but predominantly government. That could be corporate registrations, liens that you have from taking out loans. That could be Warrant Act filings. So if a company is going to have an especially massive layoff, they actually have to warn the government 90 days in advance, things like that. We take a look at all kinds of data when we opine on the health of a business from the public realm. The second place we collect data is from the web at large. We maintain, a crawling operation that looks at all kinds of things like, the business's underlying website, how it appears, in a search engine, what other results, are linked to the business. This kind of data actually helps us build machine learning models to predict things like whether a business is open or closed, whether a business is in a specific industry or not. Think about it for insurance. It's extremely important to validate whether something is a restaurant or a bar. That basis of that identity is so helpful down the line. And then the third sources of data is from the bank themselves. So actually part of a banking consortium where we help and contribute upstream the identity of merchants. And then we get some signals from merchant transaction data, like how often people are kind of swiping things at a certain place, how many unique customers, what's the stability of their card revenue, giving us a window into the credit worthiness, the growth potential, signs of distress. Maybe this business, has just utterly stopped transacting for months. Giving us the ability to create very much so like a FICO-like piece of intelligence that allows folks to lend to small business. You have to understand there is no credit bureau for small businesses. And so part of the problem that's been happening is for large business, you have a big corporate veil from a liability standpoint, okay? Everyone knows how to rate them, what rating they have, how creditworthy they are. For small business, the job looks so hard for the banks, and it becomes so difficult to parse through all of this data and all of the uniqueness of individual businesses, business model and operations, that they just give up and say, okay, well, we'll give you this credit card, or we'll give you this $1 million term loan, or we'll give you $50,000 to create an outdoor space for your restaurant. But you, Mr. or Mrs. Business owner, will have to personally guarantee this, creating, I think, what is a completely perhaps unnecessary divide in between small companies and big companies, competitive, equal footing. Because it's not just capital, it's capital with the ability to take risk and innovate with that capital that businesses need, right? Imagine if every Wall Street CEO was liable, their homes, their cars, their savings for, whether or not they go under, and compare that with the restaurant owner, who now is suddenly being asked, because fundamentally, the financial system, it's not efficient enough for them at scale to rate these companies from a credit perspective. Just kick it back to a personal guarantee. That's no bueno in my opinion.
This is actually, I'm going to latch on to 2 points here. Both of them not only relevant to command prompt, but all small businesses that you stated. That is something. I'm going to start with your last point and then move back to your second point. Command prompt is a perfect example. We have been in business as a corporation. We've been in business since 2000. We've existed since 97. We have never bounced a check. We have zero debt. except for 2 years when when I was personally going through a divorce. We have been profitable every single year, period. We are the picture. We've never, never overdrawn an account, nothing. We are the picture of a company that you want to loan money to. If I was a person, and we could get into the whether or not company or corporations or people a whole nother time. But as a normal individual, I can get credit all day long. But as a company that represents the same values, they want me to personally guarantee or put up my house or something like that, even for what most people would consider a small amount of money, let's say $250,000. And I shouldn't say people, I should say companies would consider a small amount of money, $250,000. And you're right, because we've tried. We have had business initiatives that have been held back because of funding, because we're a cash-based company. We've gone to the bank and said, look, we don't want to do VC. We don't want to go that route. We want to do a legitimate, give us money for a small period of time, and we will make sure you get your interest rate back plus principal. Let's have a good relationship. And we even deal with small banks. And they said, sure, we're happy to, but we're going to put a lien against this piece of property that you have. And you need to personally guarantee that if the company doesn't pay it back, you're going to pay it back. And to me, I could see that in our first, let's say, 5 years, right? Because most companies fail within the first 5 years. But we, as an entity, are 25 years old. And yet it is still all but impossible for Command Prompt to get a small loan, to invest in itself, to hire people, to bring people up out of their current socioeconomic status and invest in them to be better people, better society members, allow them to have more consumable power, right? It's all but impossible because the banks require that all of that risk ultimately falls personally on the primary shareholder. So from that perspective, I find what you're doing fascinating. Now I'm going to go back to the second point real quick, because this is something that a lot of small businesses do not understand. It all boils down to this now: the social presence. Now you could say public presence, but it's not a public presence, because a public presence still to this day could be argued is just an ad in the yellow pages. Even they do still exist. We're talking about your social presence. When you say who are linking to the company, what kind of information is out there about them, how are they connected, what's the web archive say, what's their artificial turnover rate, all these types of things that are all socially connected in the public space. That is vitally important. And I will give you a perfect example. If I come to your website and there is not a phone number, I will not do business with you. It's not that I'm holding on to some romantic notion of being able to walk into an office and shake someone's hand. It's that a phone number is at a minimum, it's a minimum level of guarantee that there is a human, not an algorithm, behind the company. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't use algorithms, data science, machine learning. Of course we should. But fundamentally, there's got to be a throat to choke. And a lot of small businesses don't get this. And so you'll see things pop up that, they're wondering why no one sees them as credible when someone has a business page on, some public website versus a domain name. They don't have a phone number. They don't have an email address that associates with their domain name. There's a lack of credibility there. And what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that you help banks, for example, see that lack or not lack of credibility through those social metrics. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Through all kinds of metrics, right? The ones that we find on the web, which to your point are inherently social, right? Like the Yelp presence of a company. If a restaurant is not on Yelp, that's actually kind of weird, right? If a technology company,
Which is funny because I've never used Yelp in my life, but
I know I'm actually I'm a bad Yelp user. I don't use, I'm in the same segment of the population where I'm kind of walking by the restaurant, looking at the menu, and I'm like, oh, that looks good. But there are all kinds of things that kind of trigger, is this a good business? Is this a bad business? And overwhelmingly, we believe, the financial ecosystem just doesn't do a good job enough of identifying, the good businesses, right? They have more capital than they've ever had before. I mean, we've been living in a low interest rate, money flowing environment for over a decade now, 14 years, right? And these banks are very excited to lend to businesses, but they just, again, there are 30 million small businesses out there. This is not 5,000 publicly listed companies. Unentangling the entities alone is a difficult job, right? And so identifying those key things, we feel is really important to unlocking credit without personal guarantees, and all kinds of things that we think the sector needs for sustained growth, especially after last year.
Yeah, it's actually funny that you brought up how much capital there's out there. I was reading the Wall Street Journal today or last night, and it said, it was an article about banks saying, please God, spend some money. Stop putting all your money in us. Because there are some companies, I mean, Apple's a good example. Apple has so much cash, they could be their own country, right? You spend some of that, So you're right. I mean, interest rates have been so low. Inflation has been so low. We're seeing that creep up a little bit now. What is it? Let's segue here, because we've our listeners, they're used to a little bit of the people stuff, and we want to make sure that we discuss that as well as what is really a fascinating topic. What you're doing, I think it is not only noble, but I think it's righteous that someone is, and I don't mean like righteous, man. I mean it's a righteous thing to do, to be in a situation where you are a company trying to help small companies, which what a lot of people don't realize is, as big as Google is, Microsoft is, Morgan Stanley is, the economy is driven by mom and pop. The economy is driven by companies of 250 employees or less. That is where the real inertia moves forward. And so I do think it is a great thing that you're doing to help these companies have a more equal footing, to allow them to invest in themselves through providing the larger companies that lend the money, metrics that say, hey, yeah, okay, so they're only $10 million a year, but they're only looking for 250 grand or 500 grand, and their financials are stable, their social metrics are stable. So yeah, let's give it to them, and let's give it to them at a fair interest rate. I think that's awesome. But you and I, before we got into the public part of this podcast, we kind of bro loved over something, which was music. And you had mentioned that you're very big into jazz. You were a DJ in college. And then we talked about you too. Tell me a little bit about, and before we get into like genres, because we can geek out over music all day long, and we'll get to that a little bit. But let me phrase it this way. You're angry. Something happened. We all get there. We all like to pretend that we've got it under control, but sometimes you're literally one drop of coffee on the countertop to a sledgehammer to the kitchen, right? Not that you would actually do it, but that's the feeling, right? In your gut, there's that fire. And hopefully that fire is, doesn't demonstrate itself in you destroying your kitchen, especially in New York, where, you might knock through a wall and be in someone's bedroom. But what is that one artist, that one piece of music that eloquence, that sweet romanticism that flows through and brings you back to the wonderment of humanity that exists for you?
Oh man, what a question. Um, I think if I would have to pick one, there is this jazz organist named Jimmy Smith, who I once got to interview in a way much similar to how I'm being interviewed today. Well, this one jazz organist named Jimmy Smith, who basically is the person to have brought in kind of funk into jazz. If funk even maybe came out of jazz, he collaborated with everyone. He was extremely prolific, and his just mastery is about creating this extremely complex jazz progression, kind of masquerading as just smooth, good feeling mojo music. And for me, Jimmy Smith is like that is my ground, so to speak, when it comes to music. And I love all things like rock music, classical music from like Southern India, whatever. I'm very, very eager and voracious when it comes to music. But Jimmy Smith, by far the man, and such an amazing musician, was very, very kind of early to kind of collaborate and cross over his music into more mainstream out of jazz, and it's just someone that makes me feel so good.
That's excellent. So there are two pieces of music for two different moods for me. And obviously we all have our different music. If you're sad, especially if you want to feel sad, right? There's certain music you'll listen to, and there's, music has an emotion that is good music that you can really attach to. But there's two pieces for me. That one is if I'm upset and angry and I need to feel better. My partner is by far for me, the most amazing individual on this planet. I have never met someone who is more inspiring, more intelligent, more beautiful, more driven. And even when I'm angry at her, as we all do, I mean, there's always moments where, you love her even when you hate her, right? That kind of thing. There is a song, it's a B-side by U2, and it's called Luminous Times. And that song, even if it's not about her specifically in terms of why I'm upset, when I hear that song, what it does is it elicits such a deep emotional response towards the joy that I have for her that it just takes all of it away. It
Oh,
doesn't
that's
matter
so
what it doesn't matter what it is. It just takes it all away because it brings that joy from her into my heart and just washes the hate, the anger, the bullshit you deal with when it comes to the open source community, whatever the case may be. That's number one. And then if I really want to get into it, if there's something I want to get my heart pumping, and a lot of people know this set of music, but they don't know what it is because it's very popular, especially through the 80s and 90s. And it's Carmina Burana. And this set, and I strongly, if you haven't heard it, I'm sure you have, but if you haven't heard it, Carmina Burana it's actually about a series of monks who fall from grace and explore carnal desires. That's what it's actually about. But the music set, I mean, everyone's heard it. It's that dun 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 dun.
dun,
Yeah,
dun,
dun
dun,
dun dun
dun.
dun. Yeah, there it is. And that's the one I listen to. Like if I just can't get the mojo moving, I can't get into that groove. I'll fire that up as loud as I can, shaking the windows. And by the end of it, I'm just like, you know what? Let's take the world. So my question to you, Now, we discussed the first one for you, is what is your Rambo, your Terminator, your chest puffing, ego driving? What's that piece for you?
Oh, there is this one album by a Japanese kind of experimental metal band called Boris. They're actually quite big band with like a huge following. And their album is called Amplifier Worship. And it is just very heavily soundscaped guitars, kind of nonstop. And this band is awesome. The guitarist is, I want to say, 5 foot, maybe 5'1", kind of badass looking Japanese woman. And she just shreds like no one else, in my opinion. And it's a very fast, but then sometimes goes into very slow, kind of lets you collect your thoughts and feelings before it gets even louder. And for me, it's all about that loud tone versus fast. That really gets me. And it really is kind of what the title says it is. It's amplifier worship. In some senses, I'm also like a hi-fi geek, and I just like almost sound more than I like music. Or I'm obsessed with music and more so the tone than the melody even sometimes. And that album really does it for me.
So the band is named Boris?
Boris, which is, they named it after a song by the punk band The Melvins, who I guess they're like a grunge band from the 80s. And this band is named Boris.
Interesting. Boris?
Boris. And I think their like URL is borisheavyrocks.com.
I'm going to look into them because I'm a big fan of guitar. I've seen, and I know that this sounds pretty, I don't know, commonplace, but like I've seen Eric Clapton live, and obviously U2 live, things like that. And so I've never heard of Boris, and so I'm definitely going to look into them. On that note, we are closing up on some time here. Is there anything, whether it be people related, family related, society related, or business related, but we did talk about Enigma quite a bit. I think that your technology is interesting. Definitely would like to follow up on that and get a little more geeky, maybe get a CTO or one of your data engineers on to discuss, without giving away the secrets, but maybe some methodologies that you use that are a little bit deeper versus just the three components that we discussed.
Oh,
but
totally. And I'm happy to geek out too, whenever works for you all. I mean, they kind of kicked me off the engineering team a couple years in. Let's put it that way. I got fired from the engineering
I've been there. I've been there.
I think there was like properly a funeral for the last line of code that I had running. But I'm still heavily involved. I mean, I think the one thing that I could tell you about us going a little bit more deeply is that we're so much more a data science shop than a machine learning shop. Like, machine learning is prevalent everywhere and everything that we do. But for us, like putting a quality data product out, it's not just what algorithm you use. It's about, how do you think about the training data that you're collecting? Can you generate it? How do you think about your quality process? How do you parse out research versus development? How do you, like, the kind of the culture of having a thriving data science organization is much more important to us than any one specific, machine learning technique. And for us, most of the machine learning is in our entity resolution process, like taking, very, very disparate data sets, having, kind of incomplete attributes for one entity in each, and then combining it into a single cluster and a definitive view of that entity kind of collapsed across all of the data. That's where most of our machine learning work really is. But if I had to say something that I'm really proud about, is that the team's kind of understanding that data science is a much larger thing, that is a thing that kind of forces you to think deeply about the real world as well, right? Like what is even a company? If a restaurant moves 20 blocks and changes the menu, like, is that the same company, right? Or if ownership changes and the menu is the same and the location is the same, but the way the business is run differently, like there's all kinds of kind of deeply philosophical questions when you work with data, and engaging those, I think, is key to success. So if I was going to geek out on anything, it's this: data science greater than machine learning.
So it's interesting that you bring that up, because we did have a podcast recently. I mentioned she was a weightlifter as well as a data scientist. Stephanie Kermer, fascinating lady, really brilliant. But her background is sociology. And so we had a long discussion about the societal impacts of data science, and the idea of, just because we can, should we, because we have this data. Because data is, a data set tends to be Boolean, and you have to take into account the gray areas. And that's kind of what you're talking about, right? Is taking into the gray. For example, if a business moves 20 blocks and changes the menu, is it still that business? Well, that's a gray area. From a data perspective, if the legal structure didn't change, it's still that business. But the gray area of that is the variable of, is that new menu and location going to be successful? And with that, I want to thank you for joining us. We'd love to have you on again. This has been fascinating. I was not aware that in the marketplace there was options for small business in this situation. And obviously you're working directly with the companies that small businesses work with, but hopefully something like this will continue to help these small businesses thrive. I have nothing against big business, but I would always prefer to do business with someone who is local within my environment for most things. And with that, thank you for attending and listening to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it.